In the last year, I've mostly finished the last book of poems I talked with you about last spring, The Alphabet Not Unlike the World, and I'm still waiting for final substantive edits, but it was accepted by Milkweed Editions, and it's going to be coming out in June of 2012. And so what I've been doing in between is I've been starting a new project, and I was trying to put in words for myself how I was going to talk with you about it, because a lot of it is still in its brewing stages where I'm not completely sure what it is. And so I will say it's creative nonfiction, it's prose, it's going to be lyric essays. And so what I brought at some point when you asked me to read, I brought a piece of short prose that I published in another magazine last fall. And I also brought one of the many pieces that I've been reading and thinking about as I start to build this new project.
Oh, and now my turn.
Yes.
Well, I turn off my cell phone.
Yeah.
Well, mostly I've been promoting my book, and that involved, a dozen and a half readings in Minnesota, in Milwaukee, in Kansas, in Iowa, and I drove about 4,000 miles over the course of the fall promoting the book, and did that with for a while with walking pneumonia and while recovering from walking pneumonia. And what else? That's been, that was the biggest thing, I suppose, was the book promotion. You discover, after a while that you drive a long way and read to 3 people, including the bookstore owner. But the bookstore owner's key, because if the bookstore owner likes your reading, they'll hand sell the book, and that's, so the amount of, the number of people at a reading don't matter, really, as long as that one is there and they like you. And I guess you also discover that people tend to ask the same questions, and whatever the reading is, you can count on the same handful of questions coming up, which makes it, every so often somebody throws you a curveball, and you want to say, hey, that's not one of my questions, but, I think that's what I've been up to.
I think you said at some point that he had driven 250 miles a week on average, in addition to teaching his classes full time, because almost everyone says, and I found this to be true, and John's finding it to be true, but when you're promoting a book, it's really hard to creatively start a new one. I think it works better if you've already begun the project, if you're promoting a book, and which is what I'm happy about, that I've got to wait a bit with this book with Milkweed, because I'm going to be deep enough in the next project that I think the promotion will be smoother, and while working on something new creatively simultaneously. But I know John's experiencing what I did with Atlas, which is that it's really hard to begin something new while you're in that promotional mode.
Yeah, and I guess the one interesting thing I've noticed about that, though, is, and I didn't realize this would happen, but you certainly come to a point where the old book is dead to you. And it's kind of I think maybe the tragedy of being a writer is you spend all this time writing a book, and when you finally get it the way you want it, at some point, I'm not even interested. I've tried to pick up Vestments a couple times in the last 6 months and read it again, and I'm just not interested in it. I don't, I don't mind reading it to other people, but I have no interest in looking at the book myself, and I don't know how long that'll last. But I suppose it's a good sign that I'm ready to move on to the next project. I don't know. Did you have that feeling with Atlas, where the book was dead to you?
I don't know that it was dead, but it was. For a while, when it had first been published, I really wished I could get in there and tinker with it. I kept thinking, oh, I know what I would do with this now. And at a certain point, I had to write my way out of Atlas, because for a while after that book had come out, I kept writing poems that were very similar that really could have been in that book. And then, but I didn't want to publish another book of poems until it looked different. And then one day, a day came where the poems were starting to look different. And at that point, I don't know if it was, dead to me, as you say, but my concerns had shifted. But that was, to me, that was the surprise. I thought, I'll finish a book and then I'll be able to sort of drop it out of my life. And it just sort of stayed for a while, that there was a continuity to my writing that was not, I couldn't just turn off that way of thinking and that style of writing.
That's, because I guess kind of playing off of that and finishing my earlier thought too. I mean, a book, when you're working at it, a book is a living, organic thing. It's growing and changing. And I went through the same thing when I finished Vestments, where I wanted to, I'd read, and I still occasionally read and say, I wish I'd done that a little differently. But in general, I'm not even that interested in it anymore. And so I'm trying to move on to the next project too. And unlike with poetry, where, you were writing poems that were like the ones you'd been writing and trying to get past that. I mean, I'm very consciously, the next novel is different. It's in third person. I'm trying to, it's got right now, what little of it exists has a very different voice than Vestments had. And that's kind of, it's a much, I think it's probably a much more drastic experience than moving from one book of poetry to the other, because all of a sudden I'm in that unfamiliar voice without having written my way to it. I'm just, it's kind of like I took a broad jump, and I'm hoping I'm landing okay.
That makes sense. And I mean, shifting to prose, I've shifted to prose. That has been an easier shift out of the alphabet book. I mean, I still kind of miss those alphabet poems. I liked exploring those hieroglyphics. I liked riffing off them. I'm sad I ran out of letters, basically. But this is so different. It's so different to write prose. It's bigger, it's airier. If I try to write it in the style in which I write a poem, it gets so compressed. Nobody wants to read more than half a page of it without getting exhausted. And so the challenge has been that, and then that sort of marathon feel. There's an instant gratification to poetry that you don't get with prose, or at least I'm not getting with prose, because you can write and write pages and pages and pages, which feels like pushing a boulder up a hill, and then just dump those pages. And poetry, you know pretty fast with this little economical thing whether you like it and you'll keep it or you won't.
Yeah, and that's something, I guess something I'm running into with the new novel is, right now I have no idea if it's good. I doubt actually that it is, at least at this stage. And so you've got to kind of force yourself to sit down and put in the time to write a fairly substantial draft, kind of on faith that like with the last one, if you stick with it long enough, it will grow into something viable, and yet you don't know, and you're very aware while you're writing a novel of all the novelists you've read about and seen interviewed who talk about writing a 400-page novel and then throwing it away because it just wasn't any good. And so you're always, I think, probably afraid that your next one is going to be that one.
Well, there seem to be two stages of closure. There's the finished thing that you send off to a publisher, and then there's the book that comes back to the from the publisher that needs to then be sold. Let's start with the first stage first. There are people who don't do that. Wittgenstein, except for one little book, never did. He just kept producing manuscript. And Emily Dickinson never did. And Salinger, after a long time, stopped. I don't know whether he stopped finishing things or whether he stopped putting them out, but it kind of came to the same thing. There was no point at which he said, this is done, and it's as good as it's going to get, or as good as I want to make it, or as good as people can stand. I'm wondering if you feel that closure, that sending it off to the publisher, saying it's done before moving on, as opposed to sort of getting tired of it and putting it in a drawer, is that healthy? Is that part of the process that matters to you, or is it sort of an economic necessity because you want to make some money out of this and you want, you know, in some ways your reputations for the other things you do depend on a resume of writing and such. I mean, there's all of these economic things that are really important, but I'm wondering, for the writing, is it important to finish?
Do you have? I think it is. I mean, partly having grown up in a, you know, kind of a middle class house, but very much a, you know, non-intellectual middle class house. You know, I want to produce something when I write, and it's not just for me. So that getting something out and the recognition that goes with it and so on is, I mean, it's both important to me and it's not. I mean, I want to complete the process, but I did learn in the process of touring that I could take that or leave it. I don't hate touring and giving readings and visiting with book clubs, but if I never, you know, did it again, I don't think it'd be a huge loss in my life either. So, but you do want to put out the next book and see, just, I mean, partly out of curiosity, just to see whether you can do it again, to see what that book might look like, to see whether maybe you might get better. So there's a lot of curiosity to the process, and there's a lot of wanting to carry the process through to finish it.
Miller Williams was a poetry professor at the University of Arkansas, and he really believed that the cycle of writing ended with a reader. And so the writing really wasn't done until somebody else read it. And I think there is something grounding in believing that there's a reader out there. I know that I have to imagine a reader when I'm writing, or I don't write very well. Like there's a stage in which I just write for myself, but there's a long period in my writing where I picture a specific reader, and it's usually one of a handful of people that are both people who don't let me get away with a lot, but also are people I really trust. I know that that's part of the reason I've got a lot of the stuff I write is addressed to a you, at least my poems, and I know that a lot of that is to keep me grounded, to think, okay, there is going to be somebody on the other side of this page. Otherwise, I know I would be floating in the ether, and it wouldn't go as well for me as it did for Proust. I don't think, you know, where he was just writing all those volumes. And even though you know, book clubs and touring might not be what you imagined, I remember when I saw you, and I remember this with me too, that getting to hold the book in your hand as a finished product, I think is really a satisfying, wonderful thing to see how a typesetter and editors who are really smart readers and how a great designer and all of those people went in, because they all help you envision it, and they all try to imagine how to get that book out to readers in such a way that they will buy it or take it out of the library and read it. And they really put a lot of energy into helping you get great clarity about what that manuscript is. And they don't tell you this is what it is, but they really work with you. And I think, I don't know, I feel like I learned so much about my writing and so much about myself that the publishing part of the process is a really wonderful, you know, aside from all the economic stuff that goes with it, it's just a really wonderful gift to have these people willing to sit with your writing and help you see even better what it is and what it could be.
I agree with that. I mean, I loved the cover design process, and I mean, I was very happy with the cover for Vestments, but I actually talked Ben, the editor at Milkweed, into letting me see the rest of the designs that they looked at. And it wasn't that I was looking for a better one, I just wanted to see the various ways a couple of different designers saw the book, and it was just fascinating to see that. And,
I just know I really felt I knew my own book better after I talked to an editor and talked to a designer and watched a designer work, and I don't know if you felt that way, but there's something really clarifying and wonderful about that.
I think so too, and it just, I mean, it's another part of kind of putting to the lie the whole idea of the writer in the garret, because at some point very early in the process, you are writing for somebody else. You know, I'm not writing for her, and I'm not thinking about her, but I'm aware that Katrina's going to read it, and then I'm aware that my other reader, Michael, is going to read it, and beyond that, I start to become aware that that an agent or my publisher is going to read it, and at every one of those stages, you become conscious of different things in the writing that you want to change. I mean, there's when I write short stories, and it's been a while, but when I was writing short stories regularly, I would get one to the point where I thought it was finished, and then as I started to think about where I was going to send it out and started looking at it with the idea that this is going to be in editor's hands at various magazines or whatever, I'd end up revising more because I became conscious of things, you start killing your darlings at that point, the really clever little things that you put in the writing that you're too proud of to kill until you get to the point of thinking of actually an editor or a reader seeing them, and then you're thinking, God, that is really too cute to live, and then you get rid of it, and so that entire idea, and just, you don't produce a book without good readers. You don't produce a book without being aware of what an audience wants. Even if it's to challenge that audience as to what it wants, you have to be aware of what it wants to start with. You work with an editor and a copy editor and a designer and all that, and it's bringing this thing to life. So, yeah.
I mean, it sounds as if what you're saying is that the process is basically benign and healthy all the way through, or at least it has been for you with milkweed. I mean, what I hear you saying over and over again, whatever the things that get killed needed to die.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's not that you're making the thing worse on any standard that you're committed to when you think about a particular editor and kill something. That's quite an endorsement of milkweed. Really.
Yeah, and we had two different editors there, but both of us had experiences where editors were very respectful and really made the work better. And I had said to my editor after I had finished, and I had listened to him quite a bit, there are things that you told me that I now wish I'd done. And he said that his experience has been that most authors wish they'd listened to the editors more. That most of the time the editor's right, not always, but a lot of the time, because they're outside it and they deal with words every day. I mean, that said,
and they've got a broader perspective than you do too, because they read so widely. And I mean, and certainly, when you worked with Chip, I worked with Daniel, and Daniel is very much, this is your book. The final call on any of these edits I'm making is yours. And so when I went through, I mean, I think I took about 50% of the suggestions he made, and I would have taken, I don't know that I would have taken all of them, but I would have taken more. And for me, it was partly just the fact that we were in a bit of a rush at the end. And, you know, there was a point where it would have been nice if I'd been able to go through, make the edits, let it sit for 2 weeks, and come back. And I think I would have made more of the edits that I rejected, but I just didn't have that luxury. You know, I wanted to. There's a certain level of edits that need to ferment in your mind a bit before you're ready to accept them. And but I do. I would have definitely given a little more time to ruminate on it. Would have definitely taken more of the edits. I don't think either Daniel or I were unhappy with the result of what came out.
Chip had said to me, an editor doesn't want you to do everything he says. He just wants you to listen. And I think that seemed about right. That said, I know people who have chosen not to listen to editors or to agents about really big issue stuff. And sometimes that's resulted in a house not taking something or something like that. And, you know, it's impossible to know, I guess, down the road whether you were right or wrong to cling to keeping something your way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking of a particular milkweed book that I won't name, where what the author was doing was taking a huge risk with their audience's patience and goodwill. And I guess having taught the book for many years, I think it was an ill-advised risk. And the editor should have said, no, you're going too far out on a limb with this thing. You're trusting people to do something they won't do. Back it off about 200 pages. But so I'm wondering if your dialogue with your editors comes down to that kind of issue ever. How much of a risk am I taking in making my reader do this kind of work or accept this kind of character or follow me to this place or know this sort of weird word that people don't generally know these days. Does that happen?
I'm just curious, before we start, I'm just curious, but you teach the book, right?
It's a great book. It's a great book, and it fails with a certain number of the students I hand it to. In fact, it failed once so monumentally that the student, one of my students who worked in Barnes & Noble, found the author's next book and hid it so it couldn't be put out.
Oh my gosh.
So I mean, it engendered that level of hatred. And at the same time, there's nothing like it, and it's wonderful. So, I mean, I every year I see people being offended by the same things. I have the same trouble with the length. I have the same trouble with the choices. It's a bear to teach, and at the same time, it works beautifully. And I do my 25 copies a year, or 25 copies 2 to 3 times a year, actually, to keep it in print. It's that good and it's that bad.
I'm just wondering how much those two things go together, or whether it's possible that the things that people find they have issues with are also part of what makes it what it is. I have no idea.
Yeah, that's just the problem. I mean, you know, I don't know. I was glad I wasn't the editor of this thing, because, you know, I would have been arguing in some ways for making it lesser. I've been arguing for dumbing it down. I would have been arguing for taking out the best parts in a certain way, because they made it about 200 pages too long. You know?
Man, Peter, as soon as you turn that camera off, I'm going to ask you what this is.
Okay,
but I'm just wondering, does this typical? I mean, is this the kind of thing that comes up with your editors? A sense of, can you trust the reader this far? Can can you keep the reader with you, keep their goodwill, keep their understanding, keep their looking them up in the dictionary if they don't know, this far? Does that come up?
It hasn't come up for me yet, but I know it could, and I'm imagining to some extent it must have with John, just at least when he was dealing with New York, as far as writing about a priest in the Midwest, because those were worlds that the people in New York did not seem to know a whole lot about. John's got better experience with that, because milkweed's really the only press I've dealt with. We did deal with, in my first book, the idea of, there was this whole backstory with people with hemophilia and HIV and this whole history. And, Chip had been a magazine editor first, so he was a really big advocate of, he hated the notes in the back, he hated people having to flip back to the notes. And so he was really a big believer in trying to embed that information in the poem, or at one point we put a note at the end of a poem about hemophilia and HIV, and it's a really strange, in some ways it only could have been suggested by a guy who had edited very few books of poetry, because it's really strange where it is, and yet how right, it seems, you read this poem, then you get this piece of information, then you can go on. And so, he was a really big believer in accessibility and clarity, because that's what he cares about. That's his vision. That's, he was a magazine editor. I wonder if you would want to talk a little bit about the idea of trusting people with a world that not a lot of people really believed existed in some ways.
Yeah, I guess, and it's hard to say, because between the time that New York gave up on the book and Milkweed took it, I had revised it, and I think revised out some of the flaws that were giving the people in New York problems. One of the problems New York was having was just with kind of the earthiness, and in some sense the lack of spirituality of the priests in the book. And that was something I felt very strongly about, because that was all of my research pointed at a group of people for whom, they went through the rituals, but there wasn't necessarily a lot of spirituality always underlying those rituals, or a lot of intellectual thought about what they were doing, and that there were some very practical everyday aspects to the priesthood, and I ended up emphasizing those in the writing. And I think in the end it works, because number one, the priests who read the book, both the priests who read the book in manuscript form were one of them thought I was an ex-priest, and another one said I'd gotten into priests' heads in ways he'd never seen in literature, or rarely seen in literature. And so, and since the book's been out, I know some priest in South Minneapolis actually recommended it to his congregation in his Sunday bulletin. And I've had kind of two responses from people, lay people reading the book, Catholic lay people, and one is, I had never thought of the everyday side of priests. They were always on a pedestal when I was a kid, but yeah, this is right, I believe this. And the other is, yeah, these are the priests I've known in my life, So either way, it came through, but there was certainly a point where I had to kind of stick to my guns on that, rather than going in a direction I didn't want to go with the book.
But I thought that was a really interesting thing that someone in New York had said to you at one point, which was, and it was something that they had to think about. And John said, no, this is the way priests really are. And he said, it doesn't matter if it is or it isn't if your reader doesn't believe it. Mm-hmm. And I remember that being this real catch for you for a while, that he had to convince people who weren't really aware of a world that, yes, this is how it is.
Yeah, and I think in the end I did, but I think at the point that that criticism was made, it wasn't doing it yet, because there was a good year of revising on the book after it left New York, after it was thrown out of New York unceremoniously. That I mean, it was a good year's hard work to make it the book. So.
I remember from our last talk, John, that you started reading science fiction, and that if I'm remembering right, your earliest writing was science fiction.
Yeah.
And I'm curious. I mean, sometimes when I read a book, I realize that somebody has produced a world that has its internal markers so perfectly aligned that you don't care how it matches up with any place else, because the internal reality is perfect. The book, there's some science fiction examples. My favorite non-science fiction is Malamud's Fixer, which, I mean, this is a world, and you believe that the limits of the world are the limits of a jail cell. And you don't have any doubt. And he can do anything once he gets you to believe that that's the world. And then there's this other issue, which is, have I got priests right? Or have I got, Catholicism right? Or have I got the Midwest right? Or representational issues. I'm wondering for either of you really, in the work you do, is the kind of dialogue you have as it goes through revision about its internal world, or about its relationship to the world outside, its representation, or how does that business of coherence come in?
I know that that's the sort of thing I think about when it reaches the stage that I'm talking to an editor, because to a certain extent, I can't see it by myself. And as far as representing a world, John was just in the works, that live show they do at the Bryant Lake Bowl, and they were talking about the Midwest, and afterward I was talking to Lightsey Darsh, who hosts the show, and she grew up in Tallahassee, Florida, and didn't come to Minnesota till graduate school, and she said that her whole childhood, she knew all of these shows on TV and all these movies were set in just this place, this place where, and she just thought it was sort of this Hollywood made-up place where, this white farmhouses where people seemed really earnest and worked hard and had these very stable lives. And she didn't realize till she got here, or till she got a lot older, that all this stuff was set in the Midwest, that it was just this sort of perfect little movie place. And I told her that when I was a little girl, because the first poetry we ever read was Frost and Dickinson, that I thought there was this made-up place for the benefit of poetry, that, this place where there were ovenbirds and, like, little streams that trickled over rocks and, this whole landscape. And then I got to the Berkshires a couple of years ago, and I realized, oh, those people were just writing about the place they knew. But I thought it was like this kingdom of poetry, this place that you just hauled out for the purpose of talking about capital N nature. And so I think it's really hard to get, place is something you take so for granted, and the world that lives in your imagination is something that you take so for granted that it almost takes an outside reader to really see what you're pulling out and what you're not pulling out.
I think also you tend to, if you're trying to be true to your perception of an area, sometimes you're challenging that idea of the Midwest as this place of all these nice, earnest people in sparkling white farmhouses, and that comes up. I mean, that I'm trying to think how to say that ends up upsetting people sometimes, and certainly at a very at the point when the novel was still being worked on in New York, and I was trying to, get it right for the agency I was working with, at a very kind of young and inexperienced editorial assistant who read this and said, people seem to drink a lot in the Midwest. And it was and it was based on, and I've gotten the same response from people reading the book now, that there's a lot of drinking in the book, and that comes from having grown up in a time when people drank more, and as long as you didn't lose your job or get divorced, you weren't an alcoholic. And sometimes even if you did get divorced, if it wasn't obviously about alcohol, you weren't an alcoholic. And so there's a lot of drinking in this book that goes on without being particularly remarked upon by the characters, because those characters are living in essentially the same world that I was living in growing up, where drinking and somewhat drinking to excess were so much a part of your life that it wasn't remarkable. As long as you didn't get a ticket for drunk driving, you weren't drunk driving. As long as you didn't lose your job, you didn't have a problem with drinking.
And I remember you couldn't even see that in the manuscript for a while. That
Yeah.
you were really surprised when they said, "Wow, there's a lot of drinking in here."
Yeah.
And you said, "This is just normal." But you and I had grown up in different enough homes as far as stuff like that went. And that to me, it looked like a lot.
Right.
Too.
And eventually I cut it back quite a bit, and yet I still get comments of people talking about how much drinking there is in the novel.
So there's this world.
Yeah.
But I also think because New York is the center of publishing, that this is why I think it's great that there are independent presses everywhere, that a lot of what you send to New York as that they see as regional writing has to match their idea of the region, or has to convince them. Because I can think of at least one Southern writer who I actually think kind of overblows the South and makes it more Gothic than it actually is. And New York completely embraces his writing as writing of the real South, because it really fits that perception of the South.
Yeah, it's a little like, in the same way that movie stars often have exaggerated features, since the era of color movies that they've taken to stars with, kind of almost cartoonish features in some way, I guess, if you look at them closely. And I think you tend to exaggerate the features of your region to some extent, and that New York is comfortable with that in the same way. Hollywood exaggerates, there's no Southern movie that doesn't have a lot of colorful characters in it, a la Sling Blade, and there's no Midwestern movie where the people aren't nice and surprised when something bad happens.
And they always live in a really nice farmhouse,
Yeah,
and are really worried about money.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I always think of.
So, yeah. There are expectations in the marketplace.
For a while recently, I've gotten into watching episode after episode of kind of sitcom, romantic comedy things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm currently fixated on Ally McBeal, and before that, Firefly, and before that, The Gilmore Girls. I'll show the mediocrity of my sensibility real quickly. But I was watching them, and then after a while, being a philosopher, I had to ask, why am I watching them? And the answer was real clear. I don't have friends like this. This is as close as I can get to having the friends I want to have. This is what it would be like to be able to have coffee with these people at the end of the day. And they were successful to the extent that they nailed it. That they nailed it for me.
Yeah.
The people I wanted, the mix of people I would want to have around me. And I'm wondering if any of that makes any sense to you as writers. Are you trying to produce? Think about the reader closes your book, whatever the book is at the end. Do you want the reader to say, "Oh, that's done. It's a satisfying experience," or do you want the reader to say, "I wish I could live there. I want to go back. I want to be there a little longer. This is a place I want to hang out. I can't wait till it's long enough that I can reread it and not remember everything." Do you have those thoughts, or is it a different way of imagining what it is to write a book?
That's certainly one of the most satisfying things that people say to you about your book is I couldn't, both people, it's kind of the dual thing where somebody says, I couldn't wait to finish it and I was so sorry when it was over. And I wanted to keep living with these people and see what they were going to do next. And are you going to do a sequel and so on and so forth. And that's a very satisfying place to be with a piece of writing.
Poetry, it's not quite the same, just because people come back to poems. You know, there are individual poems they'll come back to. And what I always hope for in my poems is that they're accessible the first time, but that they yield more on the reread, that there's something that you could reread a lot and get something different out of every time. And I guess I don't think about a place as much as sort of casting a spell, that I would like to sort of leave people in sort of a realm of particular emotions or particular images. And that's nice. It's surprising when I ask people, like, for requests, if people have read my book, and I'm doing a reading and I say, are there any you want me to read? It's always surprising to see which ones did that. And, you know, it's not always the ones that are my favorites or ones that I've even thought of in a long time. But they somehow do it. I mean, that book, to some extent, once it leaves the publishing house, is really, well, not even to some extent, it's just out of your control.
I think, too, with poetry, and I may be stealing something you said once, that poetry is almost more a map of the way your mind works. And so you want, in some ways, with a book of poetry, you're asking people to inhabit your mind and see the world the way you see it for a while, rather than creating a world outside of both of you. You're like inviting them into your head and wanting them to want to get more of that perspective on the world. And so it is a very different, I like the casting a spell thing as well, but it's a very different spell you cast between being a poet and being a fiction writer.
And it's different. I mean, you kind of close the book with every poem. I just remember John, near the end of Vestments, had lived with those characters for so long that he pretty much knew them. And I remember you being sad when the book was over, because in some ways, because you couldn't visit that place anymore. Yeah,
that door really is closed, and at the same time, I was very well aware that, you know, because the book got about 100 pages longer in the revising process, and I was very well aware that I had gotten to the point that I knew these characters well enough. I could have just kept expanding it, you know, kept delving more and more into their backgrounds, and could have written another 400, 500, 600 pages and had a completely unpublishable 1,000-page exploration of the Dressler family's lives, and that really, really it was time to leave these people.
You should have written the sequel right at that moment.
Yeah. But it couldn't have been, because it wouldn't have been going on. It would have been digging within the time period that I had. It would have been kind of like an accordion, just continuing to unfold between the two ends that the book already has.
See, and assembling a book of poetry is so different, because it's like a little mosaic, you know, that you just keep adding poems and taking poems out, and it, you know, it's like a kaleidoscope. It shifts every time. You know, there's not the same coherence that is demanded of it. Though I think, in some ways, because of promoting and things like that, people are demanding that of poetry books, that there's more and more books that are a sequence, or all the point of view of one character, or they tell a story.
Well, and certainly, I mean, with a novel, though, there's also a similarity in that you keep adding scenes and taking them out, and occasionally shuffling them around when you've got a scene that you feel is right, but it's not working in one place, and then you realize it can work someplace else in the book and shed light on that particular passage of the book. And so there is a certain amount of that same shot, at least the way I write, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So you take the book to audiences large and small, you read, and you may have had your initial thought be about some particular reader, a handful of readers who you trust in some way, but now you're out in the public. Do you find yourself having had purposes for this thing you didn't know you had, so that when someone says a particular remark you think, yes, that's just what I was trying to do, or when somebody says something else you think, oh, why did I waste my time writing this thing? They didn't get it. This is awful. I mean, how does that move beyond the 5 people you trust to the public? How does that affect your way of understanding what you did as a success or a failure or a different kind of success than you might have thought initially?
If you've worked really hard on a book, it becomes a complex enough creation that you don't understand yourself all the ways in which it is working. And so it is, I mean, I said earlier that there's a fairly predictable set of questions any audience will ask about Vestments. But I've also noticed, because I've visited a lot of book clubs, and it varies from book club to book club, but with the sharp book clubs, people make observations and you think, wow, that's in the book and it definitely works. It's definitely an accurate reading of the book, and I had no idea it was there till this really sharp reader teased it out for me. And that's really cool. And I wish I could think of an example now, because I've had that happen in several of the book clubs I visited, where I learned something about the book that I didn't know was there. And that's a lot of fun.
It is, and I mean, I think in some ways it's like that idea that, I don't want to say truth is stranger than fiction, but what people come up with in their own brain is so much more wonderful and strange than you could predict. And so I'm mostly just very flattered when I hear of ways that my book affected people. The only way it ever makes me uncomfortable, which is a way that I don't think John's had to deal with, even though lots of first novels are autobiographical and this one really isn't, is that people assume that poetry is nonfiction. And so when people start asking me what feels like very personal questions about myself, and feel that the book has actually invited them to ask those things, or to make pronouncements about my personal life, that's always a little nerve-wracking, because I don't know that we've ever really resolved whether poetry is fiction or nonfiction. I just asked a grad class at Hamlin how many of you, if you could shelve poetry anywhere, would shelve it next to the fiction. And then I asked how many of you would shelve it next to the nonfiction. And the class was split about 50-50. And, the poets themselves can't agree. And so that's the only part of it going into the world that I sometimes feel a little uncomfortable with.
And you create some distance around yourself in your writing with the use of, I mean, you're not always writing in first person. You write in second person, where you're addressing somebody, or where you're putting somebody in the shoes of the second person, or where you're writing in third person. And that's a little dance that you do.
But even still, I mean, people. I mean, that's what's at the heart of the whole. There's a big controversy about a poem by Tony Hoagland right now called "The Change," and whether or not people see it as a racist poem depends on whether they think he is adopting a persona or whether he is the speaker of the poem, and it's not so easy to tell. And I think that's something that we really wrestle a lot with poets.
Yeah. Even shelving poetry between fiction and nonfiction, though, because there there's a fair amount of nonfiction in any fiction, and I do always get asked questions about, you know, are these characters based on real people? How much of your life is this, and so on. And at the same time, as we're more and more aware, a lot of nonfiction is not all nonfiction.
Yeah, that's
So,
not true.
Yeah.
Well, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, though, does your biography or some piece of your biography create, as it were, merge with the piece in some way? I mean, I think about my one of my favorite authors, Cordwainer Smith, who published as Cordwainer Smith, and I doubt that people by and large knew that he was, you know, the foremost expert in the Western world on psychological warfare. He wrote the book on brainwashing.
Mm-hmm.
He was the kind of guru of the folks who were worried about the communists taking over.
Mm-hmm.
And it changed, you know, so you have this biography which he carefully sliced off.
Mm-hmm.
And now, of course, this is part of what the introduction to each one of his books will say, and you read it in light of that, and it seems to change a great deal.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, you know, but you could have written you could have done things under pseudonyms.
Mm-hmm.
And you wouldn't have been able to do tours, obviously, unless you carried, you know, paper bags over your head or something. But is it somehow important to people reading the book that they understand that you wrote it?
I think it's really important to people, and I think it's more important to people now than ever. That it's somehow connected to reality TV and YouTube and all of our interest in nonfiction. People want to know, and you know, marketers work with this. You know, what part of is there? What's your story? Is there a way we can sell your story along with the book itself? I admit I do it too. You know, Jonathan Franzen works really hard to keep his own life out of his stories, and yet, you know, he says, you know, it's just sort of like taking the cap off my head and letting you see inside my dream world, and yet, you know, I find myself sort of turning things this way and that, thinking, wow, does he feel that way? Does he feel, is that him? And so, I mean, I don't know if that's because media has made people personally accessible to us in ways they've never been before. Like, John has a website. People email him about all kinds of stuff that we would never have been able to. I never could have found Judy Blume when I was 8 years old and written to her, or it would have taken a lot of work. But anybody can kind of sit down and fire off an email.
And
to John.
Facebook. I mean, I got a Facebook email once where the guy just kind of, without any preamble, introduction, there wasn't a friend request along with it, just kind of said, okay, so this is the way my mind works, and I've got the following questions about your book. and
So there is an
we had a bit of a
accessibility.
conversation about it, and then I kind of cut it off. But, yeah.
Authors are accessible in ways that they've never been, and that's a wonderful thing. But I think connected to that, people really are interested in what piece is true and how that connects.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything you want to add?
Not beyond what I said. Just, I mean, there is that. I mean, we're all kind of. I mean, we're much more closely interconnected than when you would just read a book and put it down and not even be able, without a trip to the library, and probably not even then, be able to find out where the author lived or anything about their life. You know, so.
I noticed, Katrina, that you had a couple of things you might want to read as kind of teaser for next year. We have a few minutes. Would you mind reading something?
Sure, I can either read. I've got a letter by Amy Clampett that I've been thinking about for a very long time, and I've also got a one-page prose piece that I wrote that's about nothing that I'm writing about, but it is my prose. Do you have a preference?
Why don't you start with the Clampett since it's on top?
Okay. This is a letter Amy Clampett wrote about going to the Cloisters Museum in New York City and seeing the unicorn tapestries. And John and I were in New York last May and got to take this same trip, 50 some years later that she did. And this letter is sort of at the center of everything I'm writing about now. And I won't read the whole thing. I'll just read about a page about her going up there. I forget if you have ever been there. If not, the next time you come to New York, a visit is absolutely required. It's a beautiful place, both in its contents and in its location. On a sunny afternoon, as this one was, its location high on a bluff above the Hudson is bathed in light, both direct and reflected. There are ramparts where you can walk in the open, and inside there are gardens where, just as I had hoped, some hothouse daffodils and crocuses and narcissus were already in bloom in the cloisters proper. Or rather, not proper. A true cloister does not exist in any aggregate, but is simply an enclosed courtyard, quite generally, if not always, open at its center to the elements and attached to a church or a monastery. A place not for formal worship, but simply for walking and meditation. Rockefeller money has made a museum of various elements of a number of cloisters, most of them from different regions in France, and there are odd pieces of painting, sculpture, stained glass, metalwork, enamel, and so on, dating to the Middle Ages. These, and above all, tapestries. The really glorious treasure is a room full of these which have to do with the mythological hunt for the unicorn. I have always loved them. Everybody does. But on that afternoon, I felt that I had discovered them for the first time. Before then, I had been inclined to regard tapestry, even so marvelous a specimen of it, as a minor art, a sort of inferior brand of painting. But on that afternoon, while I wandered in and out, visually speaking, among the little wild strawberries, the bluebells and daisies and periwinkles and dozens of other flowers, so faithfully rendered that nearly all of them have been botanically identified, which are woven into the background of each of the scenes of the hunt, for the very reason that it was not a composite work, but rather that of a single individual, and not only composite but anonymous. Not only the weavers, but the designer, and even the place of origin are unknown, and even for whom it was commissioned is a matter of conjecture. I found it more satisfactory than painting. I don't know that I was intellectually conscious of any reason for this preference. I don't know that I was intellectually conscious of anything except thorough enjoyment. The place was full of people, most of whom had cameras, and who seemed to have come primarily for the purpose of taking snapshots of each other. Even so, I didn't mind them in the least. When it came time for the regular Sunday program of transcribed medieval music, I found myself on a stone instead of a chair to sit on and watch them file in. And after a while, when the first Kyrie started, I stopped watching the people and simply concentrated on listening to the music and watching the sunlight come in at a 13th century window. The Kyrie, which of course is a cry for mercy, and the sun on the stone, a purely physical phenomenon, seemed while I listened to have some affinity, almost to be one and the same thing. After a while, when the music changed to something else, I was mildly aware that while this was going on, I had, perhaps for no more than an instant, but there is no measuring this kind of experience, entirely forgotten my own existence. It is the sort of thing that has happened to me a few times in my life, but always before in moments of great excitement and with a kind of incredulity surrounding it like an iron ring. This time there was no iron ring, no excitement, no surprise even, but a serenity so complete that I had hardly thought about it just then. I simply took it for granted. Possibly this is what is supposed to take place at baptism. But if baptism it wasn't of water, but of light. By then it was late afternoon, and with the reflection from the river so bright that you could barely look at it directly, the whole hilltop, the whole world was fairly brimming with radiance. I walked around for a while, looked at the people, and walked to the subway, rather tired, and yet rested too, and pleased with everything.
That's the prologue to what we talk about next. Right?
Yes.